Okay, hello and welcome to the third edition of the Wrestling Guardian's WrestleMania review series. This week we're going to be moving into looking at WrestleManias 7, 8 and 9. One thing I would say, I don't know if this may be a bit of an accident that it worked out this way, but these are probably the last three WrestleManias of the so-called Hogan era. And a bit of a strange kind of situation with the company at this time. I mean, I think the difference between WrestleMania 7 in 91 versus WrestleMania 9 in 93 was quite extraordinary. I mean, he still had quite a lot of names around, but there was definitely a bit of a decline going on in the company at this moment. Maybe the wrestling business as a whole was kind of meeting the challenges of other forms of entertainment. Maybe kind of Hogan fatigue was kind of setting in a little bit, I think, here. WrestleMania 7, obviously, we're going to look at here. I mean, it just in your opinion, really, like with 91 and the kind of the state of the roster at this time, like, do you still think this was, can you call this officially still part of the golden era for the WWF?
I don't think so, Dan. I mean the business in itself it was anything but the golden era, no?
Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, I think there's still a lot of big names around in 91. I mean, I think Vince maybe hadn't quite got to the stage yet where he was kind of thinking long term. I think he was still kind of relying on the guys that he had, even though maybe there was a bit of a kind of an overexposure problem going on, and fans were maybe kind of demanding a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, we'll kind of just go straight into to each show and just kind of see how we feel, really. Full disclosure, by the way, WrestleMania 7, I've always considered to be my favourite WrestleMania of all time, so I will try and be as objective as possible here. But if it comes out, then I do apologise in advance.
I mean, to be honest, this is a very, very good show. Easily in the upper echelons of WrestleMania, so I don't think you should have too difficult a time.
Yeah, I think the biggest part of it is just how underrated it is, really. I mean, like this, like maybe if I thought more objectively, I could think of better shows and from top to bottom. But the fact that nobody talks about this as much as other shows, I think, is a bit of a shame. Maybe, I mean, and there's a very distinctive character to WrestleMania 7, obviously, with what was going on in the US at the time. I mean, this was just after, I think, the first Gulf War. There was a lot of kind of pro-Americana to this show. Obviously, the main event being built around that storyline as well. And obviously, there was the issue with the change of location as well. I think they wanted to kind of outdo their record set at WrestleMania 3, but it just didn't happen. Do you buy the kind of the story that the company's put out there, that it was kind of security concerns? Or
Well, no, I mean, apparently they couldn't sell very many tickets at all. I mean, they sold less than half of the LA Coliseum out. I mean, it doesn't take a lot to put two and two together, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I always wondered why that was. Maybe it was because there was still a bit of an appetite for the wrestling business at this time. It wasn't like people had kind of completely switched off from it. But I don't know whether they went too far into the kind of US versus Iraq storyline that it maybe put some people off.
Yeah, possibly. But on paper, now, don't you think that this sort of um, storyline would be a license to print money? It certainly would have been 10 years earlier.
Yeah, again, I mean, whenever they kind of venture into these kind of uneasy, like, world stage diplomatic storylines, I think the WWE does some of its best work, actually. I don't know whether it was just, and I suppose like the idea of taking like a beloved American icon like Sergeant Slaughter and turning him into an Iraqi turncoat, maybe it was just a step too far. I don't know.
Yeah, I can kind of imagine Vince coming to that decision in his office, and while I can't really do a very good Vince McMahon impersonation, it was probably very funny.
Yeah, I just imagine that meeting where he first proposed the idea to Slaughter. What do you think of this? But I mean, to the man's credit, he ran with it. I mean, if there's anyone, I mean, we'll get to obviously talking about Slaughter when we talk about the main event. But I think just initial comments on it was that he's definitely one of these characters that the wrestling business really relied upon at this time, and he's not as talked about as some of the other sort of people who featured in main events of WrestleManias. But I think he definitely had his place back then.
Yeah, absolutely. Dependable guy, Sergeant Slaughter. Still on good terms with the company, of course, and sort of a rarity in professional wrestling, you could say, in those days.
Yeah, and I think maybe looking back today, people don't give it enough recognition, but he was a very recognisable face and name for the company back then. For some reason, it's kind of been diluted over the years. But if you ask people who are fans of the company at this time, they'll know who Sergeant Slaughter is, definitely. I mean, and obviously, like the association with GI Joe as well. I mean, he was a pretty big name back then. But yeah, I suppose so. I mean, there is a lot to talk about in this show other than just the main event. I think it kicked off in great fashion with the Rockers. I think I mentioned last time with maybe the Rockers match being kind of lost in the shuffle in the middle of the pack. I think this was a perfect position for Michaels and Jannetty to kick off the show and face a team like Barbarian and Haku.
Absolutely, and Haku and Barbarian were hardly Ric Flair and Macho Man Randy Savage in the ring, so kudos to Michaels and Jannetty for getting this match out to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, it just goes back to the whole kind of Michaels can get a decent match out of anybody.
Yeah.
I suppose they weren't quite kind of getting into the inevitable split between the two at this point, but it wouldn't be long before the kind of the famous barbershop segment where Michaels and Jannetty split up. I mean, do you just watching this match? I think, do you think it was sort of already time to do that, or do you think the Rockers maybe could have had a bit more of a longer run?
No, I think it was timed, and I mean, I'm not saying that you can tell that Shawn Michaels is going to become this massive, iconic professional wrestling star, but you could tell by that this was one of the best workers in the business, and he had to be off on his own.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, it's just a great way to kind of open the show. And I've always said that WrestleMania needs to kick off with, if you're not going to do like a special gimmick match like Money in the Bank, then you need a kind of fast-paced, like multi-man tag team match like this. And I think that kind of really set the pace really well. And the fans were incredibly into this match, which was obviously always helps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A welcome change from the last show.
Yeah, exactly. Any matches that stand out for you here? I mean, there are a few of them, but anyone that you wanted to kind of introduce?
Before we get into the Macho Man match in the main event?
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, we'll leave those to last year.
What do you think of The Undertaker?
Yeah, I mean, definitely a big point of the show. The start of the legendary WrestleMania streak here against Jimmy Snuka. Yeah, I mean, like, it's definitely not Undertaker's best match of all time, but he needed that kind of. I think he needed that platform really against a guy like Snuka, who was a big guy for the company throughout most of the 70s and 80s.
Absolutely. In retrospect, it's quite. I mean, this is an iconic show for nothing other than literally the fact that this is where the legendary streak began.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think of the blindfold match? I thought it was quite fun, to be honest with you.
For non-traditional reasons, I suppose that is probably one of my favourite WrestleMania matches of all time. If you have a separate column of like matches that you most respect in terms of the action, and then kind of matches that you just look back on fondly, I think this is up there. And quite a good storyline leading up to it as well. It wasn't just the match; it was the whole kind of going back to. I think Martel kind of blinded Roberts when he did this snake pit segment, and then Roberts had that kind of weird contact lens thing over his eye that made him look like he was half blind for a while. And it's just, I think they built this up really well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, this was a hot feud at the time. Lest we forget. And it's obviously, if you're rating it on like a Dave Meltzer sort of scale, it's never going to rank highly. But I thought they built it up to the DDT quite well, and it was a good finish.
Do you think this is an example of a match that probably wouldn't work today?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. I think they might have done one. I can't remember now. I think it might have been with Santino and somebody. They did a blindfold match, and they kind of tried to replicate it a bit with Santino like pointing and the crowd kind of urging him to. Like helping him find his opponent, but it just obviously wasn't the same. But like if you want a guy in this type of match, then you would go for Jake Roberts because he was just a master of, in-ring psychology.
Yeah, absolutely, tremendous in the ring was just young Jake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but yeah, going back to the Undertaker as well. I think quite an important point to note here is that this was the last WrestleMania where you officially saw Andre. I mean, he wasn't involved in a match, but I think he kind of came out. It's part of one of the matches, and it's almost like a bit of a passing of the torch from a character as big and important as Andre to the Undertaker. And it's almost like Undertaker took that position as like not the top guy in the company, but the kind of the well-respected, kind of beloved icon, like larger in life character.
Absolutely, that's a great comparison, in fact. And the sort of the guy who's always going to be dependable for you at the box office and who's always going to deliver.
Yeah.
In some ways, I would posit that the Undertaker's now passed that streak to Brock Lesnar.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's just this obsession you have with Brock Lesnar. I've never really understood it. But I know what you mean. Yeah, he's the dependable box office guy. I mean, like maybe Strowman could be that guy in given time. Like he's definitely on his way there, I think.
Yeah, for sure. He's never going to be he's not going to be the he's not going to be in the Hulk Hogan role. Let's say he's probably more like the Undertaker for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you see this kind of lineage going through the years with like the top guy and then the kind of second in command, like dependable guy. So you had Hogan and Andre, and then kind of moving into like like I say, kind of what would be an example today? Maybe like Reigns is like the Hogan position, and Strowman is the kind of Andre position.
And John Cena on top, and Batista and Randy Orton sort of being the.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think wrestling needs that as well. You need a kind of outlet for when the fans get a bit tired of the kind of the so-called top poster boy guy. They want to kind of concentrate on somebody else, and I think you need that. And I think Strowman's going to benefit from that going forward a lot, like taking that kind of Undertaker role. I can sense all of these people listening kind of berating me for comparing the two, but so. I think going back to the show, I mean, I think Bulldog had a pretty decent showing here. I mean, typically seen as obviously a tag team guy with Dynamite Kid, but this was his chance to kind of branch out on his own as well, and had a fairly decent match with the Warlord. Obviously, just like a very big power match with two sort of very strong guys kind of trying to outpower each other. I think that worked quite effectively.
To be honest with you, the Warlord is one of the worst professional wrestlers I've ever seen. But that being said, this match was a pleasant surprise. It was decent.
Maybe a credit to the Bulldog that he managed to get a fairly decent match out of somebody like the Warlord.
Yeah, for sure.
And another, just before we go on to the two big ones, another fairly interesting story here was the Virgil meeting Ted DiBiase in a one-on-one match. Considering the amount of time that took to get to this point and the storyline involving it, maybe you'd expect this to be a little bit bigger than it was. I mean, the match wasn't fantastic, and Virgil was never going to be a character that would kind of really stand out on his own as a singles guy. But it was kind of a nice feeling just for him to kind of get one over on his former employer.
For sure. Unfortunately, Virgil was fairly limited in the ring. So the match itself could have been a little bit better. I'm not so sure about the involvement of Roddy Piper in this one, but I suppose the storyline was pretty good. Maybe even a bit underrated in retrospect.
Yeah, it could have been a bit more. And as far as I'm aware, this wasn't for the $1 million title. Maybe they could have involved that and had Virgil carry it for a bit of time. I'm not sure, but. That maybe would have helped. And I think, the involvement of Piper is probably endemic of the lack of faith that Vince maybe had in Virgil as a guy going forward. But it was a WrestleMania moment anyway.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's see. I mean, what did you think of the tag team title match with Nasty Boys and the Hart Foundation?
This was, unless I'm mistaken, this was Bret Hart's last WrestleMania match as a part of the Hart Foundation, no?
Yes, I believe it was, yeah.
I thought it was a very good match, in fact. While the Nasty Boys didn't have a great moveset by any stretch of the imagination, that they had like the false tags and the distractions and everything. So, I thought it worked. It was a nice title change, and it was a very good match, I thought. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I think, yeah, it's a good tag team in terms of like tag team tactics, and obviously Jimmy Hart being their manager. I think Jimmy Hart really kind of excelled when he had a tag team to manage. I don't think he was as effective with the singles guys, but yeah, he kind of made this match a little bit better as well. Yeah, not the best tag team championship match at WrestleMania of all time, but certainly fairly decent, I guess.
Yeah, and we're obviously big fans of Jimmy Hart on this show.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And then you had the IC title as well. I mean, I mean, Bossman. I've never really got the appeal of Bossman. I kind of understand why people like him, but he's kind of just not for me. But he did put on a fairly decent match here with Perfect, and it almost kind of was like the start of a kind of trend where the IC title would be kind of featured a lot more in terms of like the technical younger athletic guys like Perfect and Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, as opposed to like Ultimate Warrior and Honky Tonk Man. I mean, do you think this is a decent IC title match for a WrestleMania show?
Yeah, so I no, but I thought this was actually a good match, and the crowd were into it, and it had its own heat.
Yeah.
But and for sure, the people who were invested in seeing Big Boss Man come out on top. Unfortunately, the finish just sort of like pricked the air out of the balloon a little bit. I thought the finish was so bad. Now, obviously, we have Andre's involvement in this one, but still, I think the finish is unforgivable, really.
Yeah, I mean, I get that maybe they just wanted to keep the belt on Perfect and everything, but yeah, I as much as I defend like false finishes on some occasions, I think they are useful. I think probably this wasn't a case where it needed to happen, and yeah, I agree. Maybe the match was kind of let down by how it finished, I guess. But I mean, yeah, good to see somebody, two guys like Bossman and Perfect go at it on a WrestleMania stage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I guess I mean, are we ready to talk about the two big ones here? So yeah, I mean, like I say, WrestleMania 7 is like the go-to show when somebody asks me which is my favourite one. Which I'm not 100% sure about. Maybe given a different situation, I might go for a different WrestleMania. I'm not sure. But if there's only one, for me, there's only one answer to the question, which is your favourite wrestling match of all time. And this is a very big statement to say because there's been a hell of a lot of wrestling over the years. But I always go to the retirement match with Warrior and Savage. And I think just for me, this is what wrestling is about. Two larger than life, engaging, entertaining characters, putting on a fairly decent display in the ring. You had so many different elements thrown into it as well. It was like a retirement match. You had the kind of the desperation on both guys where they were sort of struggling to try and beat the other guy. You had all the whole backstage with Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth and how we kind of aligned with Queen Sherry. And you're kind of always asking, what's going to happen? Is Elizabeth going to get involved in here? And like the way that the match finished, I thought it was perfectly done, really. Yeah, that's just my that's my take on the match because it's one of my favourite matches. But is it a match that stands up that highly for you as well? Or
Yeah, absolutely. It stands the test of time as well, and this is probably one of the first times that you saw someone actually kick out of a finisher. Warrior kicks out of the elbow. Macho Man Randy Savage actually kicks out of the splash to the back.
Yeah.
Following the press slam and everything, and you could just see the crowd buy into those near falls as well, something which we don't have today. Very good match, incredible storytelling, and this is what we can. Forgive me if I say this on every episode of a podcast, but this sort of match is what you keep coming back to professional wrestling for.
Yeah, and if I had my way, like every WrestleMania would have a match like this on it. I mean, we don't, but it's for me, it's a one of a kind sort of display, and I think it just made so much sense as well. I mean, you mentioned the like kicking out of finishes and stuff, and you could argue maybe that's something that the wrestling business does a bit too much today. Back then, it was very very uncommon for that to happen, but the fact that it was a retirement match, I mean, if you're going to be facing the prospect of your career being over if you lose, you're going to go that extra mile and you're going to make sure that you're kicking out even if you're completely spent. And I think it really added to the overall storyline. And I think like Warrior's reaction when Savage kicked out of his finishing move, I think was some of the best kind of work that Warrior ever did. He kind of like he was going to leave the ring and he was like looking at his hands and asking whether it was his time to move on, and the referee was telling him like get back in the ring otherwise your career's going to be over. And it was just so brilliantly done. I mean, it's just so much emotion going into it, and people who say that Warrior was just a one-dimensional guy, I think need to watch this match, and it should really change their minds on that, I think.
Yep, two great performances back to back from the Warrior.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the reason why people called Warrior one-dimensional, I think, probably is also because he refused to put in the effort a lot of the time. He was more than happy to, and he wouldn't. I don't think he ever made any bones about this. He was always more than happy to get his paycheck and move on, and that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, but there were certain moments in his career where, for some reason or another, he decided that he was going to give a damn, and this was definitely one of them. But yeah, no, I definitely take that point. And also as well, it's like an element of Randy Savage getting a decent match out of somebody like Warrior as well.
But Dan, I think to be fair, I'm not sure he carried Warrior that much. I think Warrior held his own in this match.
Oh no, yeah. I mean, Savage's kind of natural wrestling abilities kind of came out, obviously, but yeah, it definitely takes two to tango when it's a match this good. There's been quite a few people who've never watched wrestling before, and they've asked me like if there was one match to watch, if I wanted to kind of get into it, which one would it be? And I've actually gone so far as to kind of show them this match, and like I kind of realise the difference between being a wrestling fan and being a non-wrestling fan, because they're kind of looking at it going, what on earth is this? But if you know you're wrestling, you know that this is a big deal. And the whole ending as well. I mean, with Elizabeth coming in and then the kind of the big reuniting moment between the two. I think Heenan was fantastic as well on commentary. Like he was, this is making me sick, all these people crying and stuff. But I think it was just a great way to end the match as well. I mean, do you think it was overkill, or did you?
No, I think it's really well done. I think it would be wrestling blasphemy to say it's overkill, no?
Yeah, exactly. And it obviously set up the the marriage between the two at SummerSlam of that year as well. There was a lot invested in the in the pairing between Elizabeth and Savage. I hate the way that WrestleMania 33 had that awful John Cena Nikki Bella segment as well. Almost like they were trying to replicate some of that magic, but how dare they? At least how dare they make that comparison? Yeah, and Sherry as well. I mean, I haven't even mentioned Sherry's involvement, but like the way that she was on the ring and trying to interfere and get kind of digs in at the Warrior was fantastic, and just the way that she realised that her meal ticket had now be forced to retire, so she'd have to find somebody else to kind of jump on the back of. And yeah, I think she was a great addition to this as well.
I think if we look back at all the matches we've covered in the first 7 WrestleManias, this one is probably number 2 or number 3 for me.
Behind what?
Ricky Steamboat, Randy Savage.
Okay, no, fair enough. Yeah, I get that. I don't agree with it. This is the best wrestling match of all time. But I understand that not everybody thinks that way. But yeah, I mean, this was fantastic. And then the main event, we've got the.
Dan, I'm sorry. I just like to digress a little bit more.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
If you told Vince McMahon that he had to convince one wrestling fan to watch wrestling and he could only show them one match, what match do you think he'd show them?
Vince McMahon.
Yeah. Something involving Roman Reigns, surely.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say that Vince would remember that probably the pinnacle of kind of getting the two right people together on the right stage would be Hogan and Andre at WrestleMania 3.
Or Rock in Austin at 17.
Oh yeah. One of those two at least. Maybe he would show them the WrestleMania 17 because he obviously finishes on quite a high note in that match, doesn't he?
Yeah, and I think he feels very nostalgic about that period, right?
Yeah. I often think what he kind of thinks about the wrestling business at the moment. I mean, like, I don't imagine his heart and soul is in it to the extent that it was back in 2001 and 1985.
Okay, so I was about to digress again, but that's a much larger discussion for another day, which we'll probably have once I get to the Attitude Era.
Yeah, I mean, we'll certainly get to the Attitude Era in the series as well. But yeah, no, I'm all for digressing when it's called for.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, so just kind of we've spent quite a lot of time on WrestleMania 7, which is kind of what I wanted because it's one of my favourite shows. But so moving into the main event, just kind of moving on for a bit. So yeah, I mean, you had a ready-made story here, related to what was going on in the world at the time. We've spoken obviously about Slaughter's involvement and how he kind of took on that potentially very difficult gimmick of being the Iraqi turncoat. I mean, in terms of the match, I kind of just see it as a typical Hogan match, really. I mean, like, being beaten down for most of it and then coming back at the end to do the big victory. I mean, did you like the match as a kind of wrestling match itself?
So I actually had a problem with General Adnan. I didn't think his psychology was very good. Like, for instance, he tried to distract the referee during like one of Slaughter's pinfall attempts.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, like, that sort of perplexed me. I also, the referee sees like steel chair shots right in front of him, and so I mean, there are a few things about this match that weren't great. I think it was a little bit too long, maybe 5-6 minutes too long, and you could tell that Sergeant Slaughter was getting on by this point. But yeah, it was a typical Hogan match. I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing because they all obviously had their appeal during this time period.
Yeah, I forgot actually how long this match was. I mean, I know I think it was about a similar sort of time to the retirement match as well. I mean, and then the next longest match after that was, I don't know, about like 10, 12 minutes or so. So that, it was a long time for somebody like Hogan to kind of put on a wrestling match. I think one thing as well about this is that for anyone who likes a little bit of uncertainty in their wrestling, this isn't the match for them because there was absolutely no way that Slaughter was going to get the win here.
And it's often the case with WrestleMania.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's certain matches where you think it's unlikely, but it might happen. Whereas this one, it's like,
nope.
Imagine.
As we sit here recording on 13th of February 2018, we're a week away from Roman Reigns doing the same thing. So.
Yeah, well, it remains to be seen, but time will tell. Yeah, so do you think this was we've spoken about how it's a very kind of underrated WrestleMania. Where would you place it in terms of the all-time shows over the years?
I mean, it's certainly in the upper echelon for me. I think this show would have been better if it were 3 hours instead of 4. But it's certainly in the upper echelon of WrestleMania's top 10 easily.
Yeah, there's certain points of it that kind of drag it up a little bit. I mean, again, I'm so fond of it because of how underrated it is and because it holds like two of my favourite WrestleMania matches of all time, and the blindfold and the retirement match. And obviously Undertaker's debut as well. I mean, there's a lot to talk about here, and there's a lot to be very thankful of the WrestleMania 7 card overall. And there probably has been better WrestleManias from top to bottom, but I think this is one that you can really enjoy if you kind of detach yourself a little bit from the reality and just kind of accept that this is Vince McMahon's worldview, and that WWF traditionally was very pro-America and almost kind of followed the kind of America's position on the world stage a little bit as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a deeper discussion that we'll probably have on Vince McMahon's worldviews on another day. But I think today is the day to celebrate professional wrestling.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Cool. So we'll move on to WrestleMania 8 now, unless you had any other sort of closing statements or anything.
No, that's me.
Yeah. Okay. I think of all the WrestleManias throughout the years, this is the one show that I haven't been able to fully make up my mind about. It leaves me feeling underwhelmed, but that's not to say that it was a bad show. There's a few things wrong with it. What are your initial thoughts of WrestleMania 8? Is it something you hold close to your heart, or is it maybe one of the weaker shows?
Now, again, then this is sort of before my time, so it's not exactly something I hold that close to my heart. But I really enjoyed the Ric Flair Andy Savage storyline, and I enjoyed the match as well. I thought it was a very, very well executed match. These guys are two of the greatest ever, and I don't think they disappointed me.
Yeah,
Bret
yeah.
Hart
Sorry.
winning the IC title as well. Let's not forget about that.
Yep, no, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, it started very strongly, I think, as well. And there was a good singles match, like Shawn Michaels' first singles match in a WrestleMania against somebody like Tito Santana. Again, like a big name from most of the early '80s. This was a great way to give Shawn that rub. Pairing him with Sensational Sherry again. We've spoken about how Sherry. Her involvement in the company was really important for the overall kind of enjoyment of the show. And obviously Undertaker's second match against Jake Roberts as well. I mean, I think that's a very good match for me. And again, Jake Roberts' kind of promo leading into it was sensational as well.
Yeah, and that's how you get this sort of you get a new character over. Yeah, you have him dominate like this sort of established veteran type guy. I mean, Jake obviously got a few moves in, but he was never going to win, and he never looked like a threat to the Undertaker.
Yeah,
Tombstone on the floor, terrific, amazing performance from both guys.
yeah. I think it's in terms of star power. I mean, if you didn't know much about wrestling business at this time, but if somebody told you that the opening three matches of WrestleMania 8 involved Shawn Michaels, Tito Santana, Undertaker, Jake Roberts, Bret Hart, and Roddy Piper, and that's a hell of a list of characters, and that's just the opening of the show, you know.
But could I argue that with all of those guys involved, who are all very very good in ring workers, this show underdelivered relative to what we'd expect from them today?
Yeah, and again, it goes back to why I've never really been able to make up my mind about it, because it's got all of the ingredients of being a great WrestleMania show, but it's just something about the execution of it that just didn't come off quite well. Would you say there was a little bit of a kind of passing of the torch going on with? So you had like the three first sort of victors, if you like, were Michaels, Undertaker, and Bret Hart, which obviously three guys that would go on to form like a big part of the company into the '90s and beyond in some cases, facing against say three guys that were more kind of established from the '80s.
For sure, a lot of people would point to the steroid investigation and everything as to why some of these guys got through. But let's not forget that Vince McMahon always handpicked Shawn Michaels to be a top guy. He's the one person who doesn't fit Vince McMahon's mold of like the sort of like chiseled sort of guy who made it to the top. That's because Shawn Michaels was good looking and he was enormously charismatic. While the likes of Finn Balor and other guys share similar traits today, I mean, they very seldom come along with this level of charisma that Shawn Michaels has.
Yeah.
There's something we have to appreciate. And The Undertaker for sure is always going to be an attraction, but I think Bret Hart for sure was benefited from the circumstances and he capitalized full advantage. I'm not taking anything away from him at all.
Yeah, no, Shawn Michaels for me is one of those like turning point characters in professional wrestling. Like, you just think today how many superstars try and replicate him. I think that's a big sort of testament to how important he was back then. And yeah, it was matches and performances like this that kind of gave him that foundation to go on to bigger and better things.
I'm going to ask you one question. If I were to ask you, who would you name the 5 wrestlers whose sort of like key traits are replicated the most? I would say for sure Shawn Michaels on there because the way he sort of like used to pinball around, especially when he was in the mid card. I would say that people try to imitate The Rock's sort of comic timing and delivery, Mick Foley's stunt taking ability, and I think the women, a lot of them model themselves around Trish Stratus. So I mean, it's incredible that I mean, there are some big names in the professional wrestling industry who drew more money than everybody else, and we wouldn't put on that list. Like for instance, I'm not sure anybody's going to be modeling themselves on John Cena 10 years from now.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that John Cena is almost a model of Hogan, I guess.
Hogan.
I suppose it's how far you go back, because Ric Flair, obviously, I would put in there as somebody that people have tried to replicate over the years to kind of varying degrees of success.
The Rock himself, in some ways, was sort of the 90s onset Ric Flair.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I mean, Shawn Michaels absolutely. And again, him and Brett spoke about this a lot. That during this time they were still playing second fiddle to the big, like huge, guys like Hogan and Warrior and Savage to a lesser extent, and they were really kind of issuing in a new type of wrestling, and it kind of gave the smaller guys more of a hope that they could be featured in like the top spots in the company. So yeah, I mean, it's again, it goes back to the importance of this first kind of hour of WrestleMania 8, if you like. It kind of did foreshadow a lot of the stuff that was to come, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I think you have a little bit of a dip here with the 8-man tag. I mean, there's not much to talk about. I don't like there's like decent names involved, like Bossman, Sergeant Slaughter, and people like that. But maybe a little bit of a palate cleanser. And then you move into the WWF Heavyweight Championship match. One question I'm going to ask you here, like in terms of, so you've got Randy Savage, you've got Ric Flair, you've got Hulk Hogan. A lot has been said over the years about whether this should have been Hogan versus Flair in the main event, which I think most people would agree it would be. If you weren't going to go that way, should this match have been the main event of WrestleMania 8 if they were going to do Savage and Flair for the title?
For sure. I always think that the WWE Championship match should close out the show.
Yeah. I think in terms of like the WWF Championship matches in WrestleMania history, this one doesn't get spoken about enough, and I think it was a terrific match. I thought. I mean, the crowd were like hugely into this one, and like the two styles of Savage and Flair complemented each other perfectly well. And like the mood of the audience at the time when this match came to the close, I was just, when I watch it, I think if this is the close to WrestleMania 8, then this is going to be a much better show than it turned out to be.
Yeah, I agree that. I agree for sure. I didn't enjoy Sid Vicious and Hulk Hogan at all. I refuse to call him Sid Justice.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the one defence you'd kind of put forward is that this could well have been Hogan's last WrestleMania. Like, people weren't sure, so it's like, if you're going to go out as your last WrestleMania appearance, it should be at the end. I mean, I don't know if that's probably a weak defence. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, probably. But just moving back to this match a little bit, I mean, it wasn't just that these guys were such great technicians in the ring. I thought the emotion that they displayed was incredible as well. The way Savage brutally assaults Flair, and then the conclusion, the way Elizabeth enters and everything, I thought it was just so well done.
Yeah. One thing I've always sort of wondered actually is whether.
I make one last statement. Like we've showered a lot of praise on Randy Savage for his heel work, but here he's the ultimate babyface.
Yeah, I mean, it's a testament to the guy himself as well. He could do both roles like brilliantly. But yeah, he worked here because there was a lot of sympathy with like what Flair and Perfect were doing with threatening to show everybody the picture of Miss Elizabeth and stuff in it. But I always feel like, I mean, I like that involvement. I like that story angle, but like, would that have been enough? Maybe they could have given the heavyweight championship match to Sid and Hogan instead, and just had that match be about kind of defending Elizabeth's honor. Maybe, I'm not sure.
Maybe, but there's something about Ric Flair carrying that championship and losing it at a big event that I just like.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
That's just a personal bias.
Yeah, no, and again, that goes back to maybe like why they didn't go with Flair and Hogan for the title at the end of WrestleMania 8, but that's a different story.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, no, I think really underrated WWF Championship match. Maybe that is because it was placed so kind of in the middle of the card randomly. I mean, you had like a few more kind of palate cleanser matches to get you ready for the main event, but I think by that time, I think fans were kind of spent, and I think after that match, it was a bit of a downward trend for the rest of the show, I think.
None of the older wrestling fans have been able to explain this to me yet. But how in God's name does Harvey Whippleman find himself at ringside in a WrestleMania main event?
I don't have an answer to that. Yeah, I don't know. Pass. I mean, it was kind of a funny pairing to see Sid and Harvey together, like just the differences in size.
By the way, can I just say, former women's champion Harvey Whippleman?
Yeah, oh god, let's not go there. It's you do find that over the years, these people kind of randomly get their big WrestleMania moments seemingly out of nowhere, and it's like, fair enough, fair enough. If that's what you want to go with, that's fine. But yeah, so again, I don't know how I feel about this show. I'm leaning towards the kind of it was a bit of a disappointment, and again, it should have been better than it was. I mean, like again, what I said before about how like, they had all the ingredients of the show, and like '92, you could argue was one of the kind of deepest and most kind of recognisable rosters. And this came off the back of the Royal Rumble '92, that was probably one of the most star-studded matches in wrestling history. But when it came to actually,
Yeah, for sure. And I think maybe and in my opinion, still the best Royal Rumble to this day. It was a great show, great roster, and as we did our initial rundown, I mean, it was stacked with great names. I mean, not all of them were there yet, but you could tell that a lot of them had a lot of potential. And going back to your initial premise, maybe it did underdeliver on some accounts, but a very, very good show nonetheless.
92 was one of those years that gets a little bit of an unsung year, because you also had the brilliance of, and again, this is maybe my bias coming in, but the brilliance of SummerSlam '92. Again, there's no excuse for WrestleMania 8 not being a better show than it was, I think.
Does every British wrestling fan have that bias? Or
yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. Yeah. So yeah, where would you put WrestleMania 8? I mean, like for me, it's kind of middle of the pack or maybe slightly under. I mean, there was enough here to kind of carry it, but overall, I think the execution of it was a little bit. I mean, we haven't really spoken about the main event, but I don't really have much to say about it, to be honest.
Yeah, so I think the Randy Savage match and the Bret Hart match were really great, and I think they're worthy of rewatch, and they still hold up to this very day. So I'm going to have to go upper echelon again. I think top 10 for me.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah. Did you know the whole thing with Papa Shango missing his cue when? It's one of these talking points actually with the end of WrestleMania 8, because if you notice, like Sid actually kicks out of Hogan's
yes,
leg
exactly. Yeah, that's hilarious.
It wasn't supposed to happen.
You can imagine that Hulk Hogan probably buried Papa Shango 20 feet under when he got to the back.
Absolutely. You could kind of tell, like when Warrior came out and they were doing their kind of like celebrating together, you could see it on Hogan's face. He wasn't happy.
Yeah.
Like, he
wasn't a very
not the way it was supposed to go. And again, it's maybe sort of vindicated in the fact that either they should have gone with Hogan and Flair, or they probably should have put Savage and Flair in the main event rather than this one. But
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so WrestleMania 9 is the next WrestleMania that we're discussing in this series, and I think it's fair to say that of all the WrestleManias in history, this one probably has one of the worst reputations of them all. I mean, is this an opinion that you share, or do you think there's anything that can be said in its defence?
I think, man, it's for me, my two worst WrestleManias are this one and WrestleMania 32. This is certainly not worthy of the WrestleMania mantle, but the one redeeming quality I can think of is Bobby Heenan on commentary.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. If you look at the commentary team of this show, you've got Jim Ross's first WrestleMania. You've got Bobby Heenan involved. You've got Macho Man Randy Savage involved. That's one of the strongest commentary teams that I think they've ever had on a WrestleMania show. But definitely wasn't enough to save it. And I guess the image of Jim Ross in a toga as well was something that kind of sticks in our memories.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
And yeah, I guess it's. I mean, the main point about WrestleMania 9 is I suppose you can almost forgive, say like WrestleMania 27 or something, as maybe not having a great roster. I mean, you still had certain names involved with the company during WrestleMania 9, but they just weren't able to put like a decent show together. I mean, by no means was this the height of the Hogan era in the mid 80s, but there was still. I don't know whether Vince was just kind of hanging on to. Trying to relive some of those days and just couldn't quite do it. But I don't think there was any excuse to have such a bad show here. I mean, you still had guys like Hogan and Undertaker and Mr. Perfect and things, and people like that. I mean, would you? I suppose would you put this right at the bottom? And I suppose is it different because we personally didn't live through it? I mean, is it like do you tend to dislike WrestleManias that you remember actually seeing live more than ones you didn't see live?
I tend to dislike WrestleManias in which Roman Reigns goes over in the main event. I mean, that's something my colleagues at work tend to mock me for. But I don't know, Dan. I mean, it's sort of a mix. I actually sort of tend to look at manias I generally watch a little bit more favorably. And sometimes I find sometimes the older shows, the pacing doesn't really work for me as sort of the spoiled fan of modern professional wrestling.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but something I sort of wanted to bring up and maybe need to digress a little bit here is that Vince McMahon, and somebody on another podcast, the Lapsed fan, brought this up, and I think it's a fairly valid argument, is that Vince McMahon always has this deep sort of seated desire to install Hulk Hogan at the top of his company because he feels very nostalgic about the character, and that was the time in his life when he was sort of seen as the genius.
Hmm.
And that was when he was making so many innovations in the world of wrestling, and that's when he was perceived as being on the sort of cutting edge.
Hmm.
And from a mainstream perspective, it may not have been as popular as it was during the Attitude Era, but I think Vince McMahon always feels nostalgic about this character, and he's always going to be inclined to end every WrestleMania with Hulk Hogan on top.
Yeah, and I guess I mean it makes sense because I suppose like the teaming up of Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan was ultimately responsible for like the first great big push of professional wrestling in the early '80s. So he's always going to have that kind of nostalgia for those days. I think 1993 was definitely a year where fans were pretty much ready to move on, whereas Vince might not have been. I think in the lead up to the show, actually, there was a lot of speculation and talk about whether Hulk Hogan would be leaving and when his last match was going to be. Which I think I think that was happening in the last WrestleMania show as well. So it's just it's a very very long transition from Hulk Hogan actually leaving the company, which I always found to be quite funny. I think.
And another thing then that we need to mention is that Vince McMahon does not move away from someone he perceives as a top babyface willingly.
Hmm.
You've got to drag him kicking and screaming. Vince McMahon wouldn't accept defeat on the Ultimate Warrior. Vince McMahon would not accept, with the exception of Lex Luger, I guess. Vince McMahon
Mm.
never accepted defeat with John Cena. He kept pushing him no matter how much John Cena got booed. And today, Roman Reigns, who is nowhere near the merchandise seller or ticket mover that John Cena was in 2006,
Hmm.
still gets the push from Vince McMahon, despite the fact that Roman Reigns has proven that he is not a box office attraction.
Hmm. Yeah, and as we all know, I mean, Vince is a control freak, and like his biggest fear, I think, is having a company full of guys that he doesn't know what to do with. So, I guess when he decides that this is his guy and he knows how to book him properly, he's going to stick with it because the alternative is just not worth considering. I guess, which is a shame for guys throughout the years that kind of missed out on that top spot, like CM Punk and Daniel Bryan, and even going back to Macho Man Randy Savage as well. I think there's a they could have maybe took that torch from Hogan and carried the company into the future, but it's just not something that Vince was willing to do, unfortunately, I guess. And I think WrestleMania 9 is a perfect example of that happening, obviously, with the way it all concluded as well, which I guess we'll get on to talking about in a second.
Right, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, going back to the show, I mean, there are. With WrestleManias, there's normally one or two matches you can pull out and say, well, this wasn't that bad. If you look at other sort of terrible shows with, WrestleMania 11, you've got the kind of the championship match with Shawn and Diesel, which wasn't too bad. You've got 27, you've got Undertaker and Triple H. WrestleMania 9 doesn't really have that. I mean, the opening match wasn't bad, like Tatanka and Shawn Michaels for the IC title, but I guess there's just so many like stupid like false finishes in this show. Like I've always been somebody who doesn't mind having a false finish when it's needed, but you don't. Like almost every match on this card has some kind of a screwy finish, which is just makes it again one of the worst WrestleManias in history, in my opinion. I mean, were there any matches on this show that you kind of are fond of at all?
Honestly, then it's kind of difficult to pick like a silver lining out of any of these matches.
Mm.
The one I was most curious to watch as a kid was obviously the Undertaker versus Giant Gonzalez match, because the streak was it was a hot commodity in my younger days, and I wanted to see, who is this one guy that the Undertaker never pinned or submitted.
Yeah, I've heard it a lot said about over the years about how the Giant Gonzalez match at WrestleMania 9 kind of discredits the streak almost because it was. I mean, yeah, again, like, it's seeing it through different eyes, I guess. Like when you're a kid, Undertaker was gaining that popularity, and going against somebody who's visually so impressive with Giant Gonzalez. But looking at it when you're a bit older and looking back on this match, it kind of strikes you as a little bit ridiculous, and that disqualification ending. I mean, yeah, Undertaker got the win, but it kind of, I think it limits the big sort of 21-0 streak almost. I don't know if that's been a bit harsh.
I think maybe he's a little bit harsh.
I just think it's a horrible match. I don't know. I don't know. What was the Giant Gonzalez character? I don't get what Vince's thinking was here. I mean, yeah, I get that you want to have big guys in your ring, but there are limits to in terms of talent, and what people can actually do in the ring.
I would say what Vince McMahon gets is essentially the same thing. Vince McMahon, as we've said before, Vince McMahon isn't the most creatively inclined human being.
Mm-hmm.
He likes to. He's very derivative, and and whenever he sees someone who is 7 foot tall, he sees Andre the Giant.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's true. But let's not compare Giant Gonzalez to Andre the Giant, please, because it's far too early in the morning here to do that. I guess one match which you could maybe forward as being not too bad was the tag team match of the Steiner brothers versus the Head Shrinkers. Two pretty decent tag teams with like their own characters and everything, and the action wasn't too bad at all. I mean, this certainly isn't Heart Foundation versus the British Bulldogs, but it's kind of 1993's version of it, I guess.
Yeah, and it's always nice seeing Scott Steiner pull out the Frankensteiner for the win.
Yeah, I would say that was one of my favourite moves from this era, the Frankensteiner. I think it's very. Is it even legal anymore? Do people still do it now?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I remember seeing John Cena do a Hurricane Rana not so long ago.
Yeah.
I mean, since it's John Cena, it's a slightly clumsier version of Scott Steiner, but still.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that wasn't too bad. But then straight after you've got Doink the Clown versus Crush. I mean, well, what were your thoughts on the Doink the Clown character? I mean, he's a little bit of a divisive guy in this time. Like, did you like the Doink the Clown character?
I'm not sure if you remember this, but do you remember there was this WrestleMania arcade game by the people from Midway, the same people behind Mortal Kombat, if I'm not mistaken?
I think I remember it.
Which had like Lex Luger, Bret Hart, Yokozuna, The Undertaker, and Doink the Clown.
Mm-hmm.
Ring a bell?
I think it does ring a bell, actually. Yeah. One of their childhood
memories. So Doink the Clown is always my favorite character from the video game, and I had never seen him on TV. I had no idea what this character was, and I enjoyed him greatly. So I was very disappointed when I found out that Doink the Clown was just like this sort of lower card jobber type.
I always thought he worked much better as a heel. This like scary clown that came and like scared children and stuff. But yeah, this is just a great example, really, of the of how limited WrestleMania 9 was as a show overall. I mean, it was like they could have maybe got a decent enough match out of Doink the Clown and Crush, but then it was just a stupid ending with like a second Doink came in and like I don't know, he pulled the whole switcheroo like before it was cool, Twin magic, yeah. Yeah, that's moving swiftly on, I think. One interesting match here is so you're bringing in Razor Ramon. That's his first WrestleMania match, I believe, against somebody like Bob Backlund, who was a former WWF champion back before WrestleMania was even a thing. I think they could have done a lot more with this. I mean, I get what they were doing. Obviously, like a young young lion like Razor Ramon going over against an old legend, but it was just it was such a quick sort of squash match, and it's crazy to think that just over a year's time, Bob Backlund would be WWF champion again. It's crazy.
Yeah, and he would make Bret Hart, who was going to be the face of the company for a few years, tap out. Well, not tap out, but he still submitted.
Yeah, although I must admit I think that was a fantastic match. The was it Survivor Series, the two of them? Just because I think it's just Owen Hart's involvement when he was just encouraging his mum to throw in the towel, and it all turned out to be a big bruise. It was brilliant. But yeah, it's strange seeing Bob Backlund on this show, like losing to Razor Ramon in such a quick fashion. But I guess they were obviously just trying to build up Razor Ramon as a character, and similar as well with they're bringing in the new version of Lex Luger as the narcissist against the Mr. Perfect. I think you were saying last time, like, why did Beefcake have any business beating Mr. Perfect here? And again, Mr. Perfect has to do the job to a kind of untested Lex Luger. What did you think of the Lex Luger narcissist character?
To be honest, I didn't like it at all. It just didn't click with me for some reason. I don't think that anything Lex Luger ever did really click with me. Even when he was in WCW in '96 and beating people and he got hot for a minute, I never really enjoyed Lex Luger at all.
Yeah.
He's just there's nothing there for me. There isn't enough of a charisma. He's just a guy with a good body.
Yeah, that was pretty much it. And yeah, I mean, I think Lex Luger, like his career and stuff, it becomes a big talking point when we look at next year's show. I mean, there was no indication as yet with WrestleMania 9 that he was going to be the next Hulk Hogan or anything, but Vince was obviously sort of making plans himself that not many other people agreed with, unfortunately, for Lex Luger. Yeah.
Well, the man saw Giant Gonzalez as the next Andre the Giant, so that was coming.
Yeah, I always it's just interesting to think what state the wrestling business would be in if Lex Luger and Giant Gonzalez were really given that push, and Vince was unwilling to listen to the fans and just kind of did what he wanted to do. I mean, what kind of company would we have had? But I think ultimately there's two matches on this card that deserve sort of special scrutiny. I think that the first one is obviously the tag team match with Money Inc. and the Mega Maniacs. A little bit of an interesting story going into this. So I don't know if you remember, it's like Beefcake in real life had quite a serious injury. I think some kind of can't remember what sport he was doing, but he needed sort of facial reconstructive surgery. And he was brought in just to kind of talk about his experience on one of the first episodes of Monday Night Raw. And then Money Inc. would come out and kind of attack him with IRS's briefcase and stuff, which led to Hulk Hogan getting involved, which was quite a decent storyline in itself. I mean, I guess both of us were too young to remember that, but do you look back on that feud with any fondness at all?
Well, it's always fun to see Bray Wyatt Senior wrestle.
Yeah,
but not really done for me. This sort of period doesn't harbor as much nostalgia as I would, for me, because I didn't really live through this period. I personally thought this feud was very mediocre as well. And Hogan without steroids he isn't a very pretty sight, no?
Yeah, he wasn't a pretty sight in general.
He looks like a noodle with a blonde moustache.
with a big black eye as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe it was like symbolic almost of the WWE realising it had to kind of clean up its image a little bit, and this is the result that we got,
Yeah, for sure. Hogan being demoted to a tag team match against Money Inc.
Yeah, it's such a change of pace from the last. I think he basically main evented what was it, 7 of the last WrestleMania shows, and then he's brought in to initially anyway be involved in this tag match in the middle of the card. It's a little bit of a change of speed for the guy. I think that Money Inc. I mean, I don't know whether they were just because I think they were actually a really good team because their whole gimmick, like I think, will always work. Like it's one of those gimmicks where like money bad, greed bad. That will definitely work today if they brought in a similar sort of tag team today and was talking about being representative of the 1% versus the 98%. I think that always worked as a storyline, and I think Ted DiBiase is such a great character. I just think he was. I think they were just brought down by not having such a great roster to work with, almost.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. They were a gifted tag team in their own right. And you even saw this thing work later, several years later, with Vince McMahon and even JBL, two very similar characters to Ted DiBiase.
Yeah, I think it always works. It's just one of those gimmicks that you can always go back to if you want to. I mean, even Del Rio when he first came in was a little bit like that, the kind of the Mexican version of JBL almost, which I think you can trace back all the way to Ted DiBiase. So yeah, I think Ted was pretty much an innovator in that sense. Would you say?
Yeah, for sure. Very gifted performer. Very gifted performer. Pity that he didn't have a run as a transitional WWE champion.
Yeah, I guess he had the was it the unofficial WWF Championship run back in 1988, but it didn't last very long. Yeah, but it's certainly an eye-catching match on this card to see Hogan in this position. Brutus Beefcake is what Brutus Beefcake is. I mean, I know neither of us were that keen on the character, I think. But then again, I mean, you got the workings of a decent match and a decent feud, but then it has to end in a stupid like disqualification ending, and I don't know. It's just very symbolic of the show overall. I think that it just wasn't executed well, or Vince just wasn't willing to go the whole way and have Hogan actually lose a match clean. Even here at 93.
Yeah, for sure, and to be fair, I'll give Vince the benefit of the doubt here, because even if he asks Hogan to do a clean job, it's not like the man is going to willingly comply.
Yeah, exactly, and that I guess leads us into the main event quite well. I mean, firstly, let's concentrate on the actual main event, which was Yokozuna versus Bret Hart. I mean, Bret Hart coming in as champion here. Obviously, like looking back, like knowing what we know now, we know that like Bret was entrusted to be the company's top guy for quite a few years after Hogan left. But yeah, do you think do you think 93 was a little bit early? Do you think Bret Hart was still kind of under Hogan's shadow almost? Or?
So I'm sure people watching at the time may say that, but I didn't feel like he was under Hogan's shadow at all. As someone who didn't live through the time, I guess I'm obviously not the best person to be the judge, but I don't think Bret Hart felt all that undercooked in this match, to be honest. I mean, you're not going to get a great match out of Yokozuna no matter what, I think. But this match went around 9.5 minutes, and I think that's really as long as you can afford to go with a guy like Yokozuna. And I think Bret Hart had a presence about him. I mean, it was obviously nothing like Hulk Hogan during his prime, but you could tell that this guy was going to be like a dependable sort of like top babyface for a few years, and he could steer the ship.
I think that's a little bit harsh on Yokozuna, actually. I considering the guy's size and everything, I think he was actually capable of putting on half decent matches. Like, I think like I certainly wouldn't put Yoko in the category of like a Giant Gonzalez or anything like that. I think he had something about him. I think Bret Hart's. I think he said in one of his interviews that he felt was Yokozuna's best match. And I don't think that's necessarily Bret kind of bigging himself up too much. I think he acknowledged that given the right opponent, you could get a decent match out of Yokozuna, which is very impressive considering obviously the amount of weight that the guy was carrying. But he did he had some moves, I guess is fair to say.
Right, and I apologize if I made it sound like I was lumping him in there with Giant Gonzalez.
Oh no!
Giant Gonzalez is in a class unto his own.
No. I guess the younger fans who wouldn't know anything about this era, if they kind of look back and saw a few matches with Yokozuna in it, I don't think they would fully appreciate like Just how kind of important he was as that almost like the kind of transitional heel that Vince could depend on. Because if you're trying to build up new baby faces, you need to have heels to put them against. And I think Yokozuna was quite a good guy to go with. Unfortunately, a lot of '93 or the rest of '93 was spent with the Lex Luger and Yokozuna feud, which didn't exactly capture people's imaginations. But then when you go forward into next year's event, WrestleMania 10, Yokozuna is a key central point of that, I think, and he really helped, Bret Hart in his kind of early days as champion.
Right. I think that's fair. That's fair to Yokozuna. Um, did you think this match was better than their encounter at WrestleMania 10?
Um, I'm not sure. I think it's difficult to say because I think in terms of just taking the match and taking it out of context, I think WrestleMania 9 probably was the better match of the two. But obviously you can't ignore like all the stuff that came, like the stuff that surrounded it. I mean, WrestleMania 10 was just a better show overall anyway. Like the moment for Bret Hart winning that match was very, very special. Whereas back here you've got Yokozuna kind of winning in a screwy way, and then you've got the whole thing that happened after it as well. But I suppose like match for match, maybe WrestleMania 9 was the better one. I don't know. Don't know if you agree.
Maybe I would lean with you that way, but as you say, winning Bret Hart chasing it and winning the title at Madison Square Garden has a special appeal to it. So if gun to head I had to choose one, I'd probably go with that one. But in a vacuum, yeah, I'd agree with you. I think this one may be the better match.
Yeah. I think it's very difficult to separate wrestling from its context as well, especially when you're looking back at old shows. But that maybe this is the one silver lining of WrestleMania 9. This match in itself, when you ignore obviously what happened afterwards.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. Then I don't think this is a particularly great match.
Fair enough. I'm always the optimist. I'm always trying to find some positives too. And I guess we have to talk about the conclusion of this show. So, I mean, there's been lots of different versions of the story told over the years as to exactly what happened. I think generally people seem to agree that whilst Hogan was willing to kind of end Hulkamania and kind of have somebody ultimately go over him, he wasn't willing for it to be Bret Hart. Whether that's because he didn't believe in the whole babyface versus babyface concept, or whether he thought Bret was like too small a guy maybe to end Hulkamania. Do you have a particular spin on this at all? Like, do you think it was just Hogan's ego coming in like it always was been, or do you think that there was some logic to Hogan's thinking back then?
I think it was so. According to Dave Meltzer, the smaller guy defeating somebody the size of Hulk Hogan wouldn't bode well for Hogan in the long run. So I think that was just Hogan, as usual, watching out for himself and trying to make sure that he was as profitable as possible. I mean, clearly he didn't see his wrestling career ending after that loss. Clearly he knew that there was a whole another act to come. So I think that was just Hogan looking out for himself as usual.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you got to give credit to Bret Hart as well. I mean, you mentioned how kind of dependable he was as a guy back then for Vince McMahon, and not everybody would have been willing to have WrestleMania end in the way it did. Just the way, even the way Bret Hart's is kind of signaling to Hogan to kind of get in the ring, and challenge Yokozuna, and it's just like it worked in Vince McMahon's head, but again, just looking back on it, it's just there's so many things wrong with it, I think. And the way that it ultimately went down with Hogan, losing to Yokozuna at King of the Ring, which is the way that kind of went out. Even that wasn't a clean finish. I think it was. Wasn't it
it's the one with the fireball and the
yeah. Oh God, it was awful.
and the photographer. Only Hogan could contrive dirty finishes like that.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's just, I don't know. I mean, it's I suppose the sight of Hogan having one last WrestleMania moment at the end, holding up the belt, and I think like the occasion itself, I think the fans kind of went with it, but you could tell there was a lot of Hogan fatigue setting in at this time, and I don't know whether it's just just the guy having one last moment before he rode off into the sunset. I don't know, but I think it leaves a very sour taste in your mouth when WrestleMania 9 is kind of taken into account overall. I think.
Yeah, I think from Vince McMahon's perspective, it's clearly, in his eyes, this is clearly the biggest platform he can get for Hulk Hogan to win the title, and he appears dead set on a Hogan versus Bret Hart match at SummerSlam.
Mm.
So I mean, that's the direction he wants to go, and unfortunately, Hogan wasn't willing to comply.
Yeah.
Hypothetically, if Bret Hart would have beaten Hulk Hogan at SummerSlam instead of beating Yokozuna at WrestleMania 10, how do you think that changes the course of wrestling history?
I mean, to be honest, I don't think it changes it that much, really. I mean, I suppose Brett was already kind of on his way. I think maybe the only difference would have been that Vince would have had like a clearer vision for over the next sort of 12 months, because there was a bit of a confusion with whether he was going to go with Brett or Lex Luger, and like obviously Lex was put in the main event slot of SummerSlam '93. Absolutely horrible show that was, and then the whole two men winning the Rumble. It was a lot of confusion ultimately to get to the point that we knew he was going to get to anyway. So that maybe would have helped. But in terms of the Hogan character, like losing to Bret Hart at SummerSlam wouldn't have damaged him that much. He still would have been the big star. WCW still would have wanted to sign him, and I think things would have carried on pretty much as normal. I think it would have saved us a little bit of hassle maybe with trying our best to accept Lex Luger as the next big Americana character.
For sure. So then I think one of the most overrated notions we've had in wrestling over the last 15 to 20 years is this idea that if you beat someone, you sort of acquire like a portion of the magic that made the previous character special. For instance, Vince McMahon assumes that if Roman Reigns defeats Brock Lesnar after Lesnar's gone on a monstrous run, that Roman Reigns is going to emerge as a bigger star for it. Now, sure, that can work in some instances, but if you're not a top star yourself and you're already established at a certain level, you're not going to gain anything from a big win.
Yeah.
You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. No, definitely.
I definitely agree with you. I don't think it changes the course of wrestling all that much.
Yeah. I think maybe it's not so much the win; it's being put over in a very solid match. So yeah, I mean like WrestleMania 33, for example. Like I think Seth Rollins gained a lot more out of having a good a well worked match with Triple H than Roman Reigns defeating a kind of half baked Undertaker, for example. Like it's not the win itself; it's the match itself. And if you want to be put over as a young up and coming guy, you want to be facing guys that can give you a decent match. Like some of the characters over the years that have helped guys take that next level, like guys like Mick Foley and Shawn Michaels. Like they didn't necessarily do that in the big main event picture. It was just kind of in the middle of the card. But people respect that you can kind of keep up with the best, whereas just getting a kind of empty victory doesn't really do anything for you going forward.
Yep. I agree totally. That's a great analogy as well.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, wrestling's one of those.
You need to have a storyline, and you need to have somewhere to move on to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, like the passing of the torch is a kind of story arc in itself in the industry, but it needs more than just that. I guess is probably what we're trying to say.
Yeah. It can't just be person X pinning person Y clean in the middle of the ring. It needs to have a build up. It needs to have a story, and the story needs to build up over a period of time. You can't just sort of hastily put it together over 2 weeks. It just doesn't work.
Exactly. Yeah, and which is why again WrestleMania 9 is just have such a weak ending to it, 'cause it just made very little sense, and just like I say, just caused more problems going forward than if it just would have been a straight victory for Yokozuna at the end. But yeah, I guess kind of wrapping up on this show. I mean, I don't think we've found anything in this half an hour or so that we've been talking about it that we can put forward as a silver lining. So I guess we have to acknowledge that this is probably one of the weakest WrestleManias. I mean, would you put it at the bottom of the pack?
Yeah, I think I would, Dan. Yeah, for sure. This is arguably the worst Mania of all time.
Yeah, and I guess it was just moving forward into our next episode. What a difference a year makes. We'll be talking about WrestleMania 10 next time. But yeah, any last thoughts from you, or should we call it a day?
No, that's about it. I'm ready to. I think we've had just about enough of WrestleMania 9.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, and we'll catch you all next time for our next episode, where we look at WrestleManias 10 through to WrestleManias 12. Okay. Thank you.